Oh, this land is so big and so lonely, but a man can get away from it all. So untie that kangaroo, he won't catch old Man Emu, for he's travelling this big country round. Chapter 13. So untie that kangaroo, he won't catch old Man Emu. As far as I was concerned, I was on top of the world in 1973. I'd got married and I already had a TV show in Newcastle under my belt. Grundy Television had conned me into being the compere of travelling out west for $150 per show, which was cheap even back then, but it kind of put me on the map. Trouble was, as the compere, I don't think I was taken that seriously as a singer. I still hadn't written anything very good since Old Man Emu, although a song called Big Country Round was used as the theme song for the program, and Old Man Emu was regularly played for the ad breaks. I received no royalties for those songs being used. I was very green, but it didn't do me any harm. To add to the wank, I had enough money to buy a Volvo 1800 ES sports wagon to drive to Newcastle every fortnight. There were only 500 of this model in Australia. It was a bit of a Sheila's car, really, but I loved its design. I had traded in my V8 Falcon 4-on-the-floor ute for it. By the time Amy and Georgie arrived, I had traded in the 1800 on a conventional 245 Volvo wagon in a clean swap with a Volvo dealer. No money changed hands. The bloke who bought the sports Volvo had one arm and the car didn't have power steering. Travelling out west was really a variety show disguised as a country music show to entice country people to watch it. Cabaret artists like Sandy Scott and Cole Joy and others always came on to promote their bush tours. It was hugely popular, and watching it was almost a religion for 2 years in rural Australia. In fact, we recorded 77 programs over 2 years, initially in black and white and then in colour. But the program didn't screen in Melbourne or Sydney, much to Grundy's disappointment and ours, and that was possibly the reason it was eventually dropped. It was produced, I believe, to fulfil NBN Newcastle's Australian content requirement. We even took Travelling Out West on the road, and what a success that was. The team comprised Tony Cullerton as producer, Emma Hanna, Australia's Nana Muscuri, brother and sister duo, Ricky and Tammy Osipenko, comedian Mal Malcolm, Jack Grimsley, ex-musical director of Channel 9's The Mike Walsh Show, and yours truly. We sold out from Sydney to Cairns. All we had for sound were 2 columns of 8-inch speakers each side of the stage, while our guitars went through our individual amplifiers. I've never forgotten what that taught me. No matter what the quality of the sound is, it's the content of the show that always wins. Having said that, I can't believe how well it all went considering the inferior equipment. Back then I was known for my wild suits and bow ties. I avoided any clothing that might have pigeonholed me as country and western. Looking back, I was getting ahead of myself, thinking I was on the way to much bigger things. It would take me 16 years to really make it as a recording artist. During the 1970s, the shit hit the fan with our farming partnership. Will and Robin both got married, which brought 2 more strong personalities into the equation. Unfortunately, friction developed between the wives. Will's wife, Virginia, and Robin's wife, Debbie, both thought Mum got too much of her own way as well. Although I was also married by 1973, I was well out of it all. Mary Kay had no attachment to the partnership. We had become Sydney-siders. Whether or not it would have been better if I'd stayed as a negotiator, I'll never know. I think I might have tried to counteract Mum's dominating character, and it would have become a complete shitfight. Will and I sold Tralee fairly cheaply. I ended up with enough money to put a good deposit on an investment property in Epping, a suburb in Sydney's northwest. Will and Virginia took off to Toowoomba to blow it all in the 80s boom and bust. Eventually they divorced and Will became a Ned Kelly tragic and returned to Victoria where his old schoolmates were. His experience on the land has made him a hard-working jack of all trades, and he still has a full-time job doing maintenance work at a wedding reception venue in Melbourne. He doesn't have Mum's restlessness. Whether it was Rob or Debbie who became restless, I don't know, but they left the farm at Cropper Creek and headed back south in the mid-70s. Debbie had also grown up in Victoria. Rob had a few management jobs on the land and built a house on the Murray River. My youngest brother Jeff had the same upbringing as us four older brothers, but was tarred with a different brush. You could say he is a dreamer, but not a doer. Dad had to virtually kick him out of bed to get to work. Perhaps by the time it came to the fifth son, Dad didn't give him the same attention along the way. I don't know. Always a rebel at school, he might have turned out okay if it weren't for the big rock concerts he went to where substances were rife. As he got older, he seemed to reject the work ethic that the rest of us were quite comfortable with. Then he met a girl who only made things worse. Jeff has ended up in Mum and Dad's old house with his 3 children and seems to be a reasonable dad, even if he has not taught them that you get out of life what you put in. The irony is he looks up to us older brothers. If he is a paranoid schizophrenic, then I blame the dope. There are some things in life that I just do not understand. The exact opposite to Jeff is Peter, the only farming son left out there. He and his wife Annie are still on knee and perfectly suited to it. Peter is the most like Dad, having engineering talent. Annie was born on the land in the area. She is the perfect partner for him. Peter is looked upon by other farmers as an innovator. He also flies his own light aircraft in the tradition of Mum's family, and even into aerobatics. These days it takes smart people like Peter and Annie to survive on the land. I still believe Mum and Dad farmed in the glory days. I must say, though, with vastly improved farming methods, such as no-till farming, my brother Peter has shown that a progressive farmer doesn't take the same risks that we used to. We used to sow after a good rain, regardless of the lack of subsoil moisture. Peter doesn't do that now. Farmers are fully aware of the soil profile nowadays. The lower prices, at least, have made them better growers. We used to burn the stubble, not realising how much it was sucking moisture out of the ground and killing good insects and microorganisms. I was always proud of the cloud we would create with a good stubble fire. Duh! That cloud was made of water from my soil. In 1976, Harvey Travel in Newcastle asked me to host a tour group to the Calgary Stampede in Canada. The tour included San Francisco and a Rocky Mountaineer train trip through the Rocky Mountains. I decided to take advantage of the trip to go to Nashville and Tulsa as well. Fortunately for me, I caught up with an American bloke who had visited us in my Coogee days, and we drove to Tulsa in his classic E-Type Jag. We met up with an Aussie mate who was a contract welder and travelled to do jobs all over the United States from his base in Tulsa. He was staying at a mobile caravan park. All the cabins were like the ones you see along roadwork construction in Australia, so they could be hooked up and moved. My mate had always been a dodgy sort and had made a lot of dodgy friends, a collection of hookers, dope dealers, con men and burglars. All nice enough people on the surface, but I learned not to trust them as far as I could throw them. One fellow with an F-100 pickup truck offered to steal me a Martin guitar. He knew a girl who had one. He was a handsome fellow with a jovial personality, but had no conscience about stealing from a friend. He had a mate who conned $500 out of me for some turquoise that was probably worth about $200. Turquoise jewellery made by the American Indians was all the rage back then, and the stuff is probably worth a lot more these days, as most of the turquoise you see now is fake. I couldn't tell you what happened to it all. I think the Aussie dollar was about 30% more valuable than the greenback when I was there. This was before Paul Keating floated our dollar and brought us all back to reality. From Tulsa, I headed to Nashville for a few days and found the place quite alien to what I was about. Just about everyone I met said I was mad worrying about Nashville when I was the compere of a television show in Australia. Nashville was full of would-be-if-you-could-be people. I met a young bloke there who was looking after Johnny Cash's publishing. We hit it off and made a good team playing pool in the hotels and bars. He took me to the House of Cash, which was a mock southern cotton plantation-style mansion with the big columns out the front. I vaguely remember walking in and seeing a secretary sitting behind a small desk in the middle of a huge entrance. Talk about over the top. I found out that Johnny Cash didn't steal songs from anyone. If he recorded one of your songs, you kept all the publishing rights. Unlike Elvis, who kept all the royalties from his recordings and the songwriter got nothing. God, if I'd only had a suitable song to give him that day. My songwriting was at the fledgling stage back then, so the best I could offer was a song called J.C. Bulgin Pockets, which ended up on Humble Beginnings. It was a very ordinary effort, about a rich man who rode roughshod over everyone. But how lucky was I to have had such a chance to be recorded by Cash. Nashville had songwriters on every street corner who could only dream of such a connection. I didn't meet Johnny on that occasion, but years later I was his support artist in Tasmania. While I was in Nashville, I walked into a shirt shop and was blown away by the variety of singing cowboy outfits. I couldn't help myself and brought about 4 shirts. I hardly ever wore them back in Australia, except as part of my outfit to go with my song Comic Strip Cowboy. Amazingly, I even wore a big black Yankee hat to go with it. What was I thinking? I was still so far from realising the Aussie way was the only way to go for me. I thought my career would have been blossoming by the time I was 33, but in many ways it had only just started. I was yet to really pay my dues. I was struggling to work out where I was going. I could see that rock bands built their own following and popularity in the pubs. They could also be more original, unlike the club scene that was all about cover songs. Tommy Emmanuel was my guitarist cum musical director. He was the best, so it wasn't hard to attract bass player Ralph Graham and drummer Shane Flew to create a band. Unfortunately, not long after we formed, Tommy took off on his solo career. So Ralph and Shane introduced me to a guitarist who had been in their band Rainshine. This really changed the dynamics, as the guy was a small-time dope dealer. His customers were mainly musos, so he was fairly harmless. This meant that the small tours we did were like a Cheech and Chong movie, all about dope smoking. I named the group JW and Crow. Our biggest tour was through the hippie country around Nimbin and Bellingen in New South Wales, where the audiences were just as out of it as we were. Later on, we went to Armidale University in the Northern Tablelands, where only one person turned up. Obviously, the JW part of the band name didn't convey the message that it was me. We didn't play that night, and the bloke helped us pack up, and then we had a beer. In fact, we tried a lot of venues with young audiences playing covers and some of my own songs, but I was lost. I really had no idea where all this would take me. Eventually, I was that desperate that I took the band, Ralph was the only original member by this time, all the way to Cairns to play at a disco for 2 weeks. Sydney to Cairns is a 2,415-kilometre drive. I had a transit van and the drummer brought his old Holden. The tyres on the Holden blew before we got to Newcastle, barely 2 hours' drive from Sydney. He had retreads on it, the idiot. Somewhere around Townsville I broke an axle. I wasn't aware that the wheel had come off until I saw it flying past me, bouncing over a fence and coming to a rest in an open paddock. Then clunk, 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 scrape. The old transit was well balanced, thank goodness, otherwise we could have rolled. But the van's Falcon axle wasn't strong enough for the load of our sound gear. We finally made it to Cairns, and the sleazy disco brothers who booked us showed us to our accommodation. The 2-storey derelict building had holes in the walls and rusty plumbing. I took one look and said, either you find a better place or we're turning around and going back to Sydney. The dickheads were a bit taken aback. Young rock bands obviously put up with this sort of shit just to get a job. I'd been around long enough to at least have some pride. I called their bluff because it was too late for them to get another band, so they found us somewhere else to stay. It wasn't Ritz, but it was a lot better. Well, the disco was an experience of nothing else. It turned out that my guitarist was gay and we didn't know. He got his rocks off with a gay DJ. Our Kiwi-Irish drummer was quite obviously shocked by the whole experience. He'd led a sheltered life, but he got over it and we played on. I can hardly remember what we played, but we got away with it. Each break the DJ came on and played all the latest hits. Nowadays, whenever I hear Elton John's Song for Guy from his album A Single Man or Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon, I get the heebie-jeebies. What was I doing playing at a disco in Cairns? What was I doing all that way from a family? To this day, I can't believe I was that desperate. Partly, I'm sure, I knew that I had to break the cabaret habit. The trip certainly did that. The last night at the disco, we were told by the dancing audience that it was a tradition to dress up. By then, we'd made a few friends with the customers, so we thought we'd dress up as clowns. I found a bowler hat, a red nose, a red and white striped shirt and some baggy pants. We'd also met a dope dealer on the edge of a cane field who sold us some Sinsemilla, really strong marijuana. It helped the craziness of the clown outfits, but it didn't help the music. But in that situation, who was going to notice? Everyone was as mad there anyway. I remember one girl who came every night and danced with herself in the mirror. She always took herself home. On the way back to Sydney, I broke an axle again, not far from where it happened before. I looked for the wheel for quite a while by climbing trees, then discovered it had rolled over and stopped a few metres from where it came off. At least I knew where the nearest car wrecking yard was, and I'd become an expert at fitting axles. Thank goodness it was a Falcon axle. They were easy to find at the wreckers. When I got home, I decided to give this clown idea a go as a band. We named the band Sydney Radio. I tried to register clowns, but I found out some smarty had already registered it after I'd had our posters printed. I called myself Ludwig Leichhardt because I couldn't be JW dressed up as a clown. Why Ludwig Leichhardt? Because the real one disappeared, and so would this one before too long. I was still experimenting with possibilities. I bought a red and white striped canvas to use as a backdrop and updated the sound equipment, but it was a waste of time. People didn't get it, and neither did I. I told the band to forget it and took care of the bills. One thing I learned was that publicans and agents treated bands like shit. Whenever that happened, I revealed my true colours and set them straight. It was around this time that Phil Matthews gave me a call. Phil had just left Festival Records as their publishing manager and had decided to go solo as an independent music publisher. I already knew him, and Phil was aware of my songwriting potential, although I hadn't really developed as a songwriter at this point. I wasn't sure I needed a publisher, but he proved me wrong. He'd heard a couple of my original songs off an unsuccessful album and was impressed. Phil reckoned he could encourage my writing and give me good advice, which he did. His knowledge of publishing was invaluable. Even today, I'm still quite naive about the publishing side of the business. It's so boring as well as being quite complicated. It wasn't long before Phil arranged for me to regain 100% ownership of my back catalogue of songs and recordings, except Old Man Emu, which Ron Tudor from Fable wouldn't sell me. In those early days, I didn't realise I could take my catalogue with me from one recording company to another. It meant the new company could use all the existing songs to create a compilation album as well as release new albums. Now I lease my songs to the record company for the period of my contract, but after that I can repackage them with my new company. I provide the recordings and artwork for an album, and then the record company takes it from there. Well, that's a simplified explanation. It varies from deal to deal. Phil and his wife Chris eventually managed my entire career up until they retired in 2010. With Phil as my publisher, our first success was with the song The Breaker. After being on the set for the movie Breaker Morant, I decided to write a song about the interesting character Harry Morant. I'd read Kit Denton's book The Breaker, which had given me more ideas for the song. Phil had the music publishing rights for the movie, and he suggested I give the song to Edward Woodward, an English stage and screen actor as well as a legitimate singer who played Harry Morant in the movie. But I didn't want to give the song away. I had met Charles Bud Tingwell, the Australian actor, on the movie set and thought it would be good to have him as the prosecuting lawyer in my song. It was fun to record, including the gunshot and the marching sound I made by overdubbing a pair of hobnail boots until it sounded like a platoon. In the early 80s, Phil also encouraged me to go solo. I decided to forget the club scene for the time being. I was totally fed up with not doing my own thing, and my songwriting was improving. Going back to my folk roots and singing 100% Aussie songs seemed like the way to go. So I invented a little wheel-in stage with an old microphone clamped to a bit of sponge rubber under the top, beneath my feet. It was the size of a small restaurant table. My music needed a thump if a pub crowd was going to take any notice. So to get through the door, it was designed to tip on its side and wheel along. I sat on an old drawer from the base of a wardrobe. This also doubled as a merchandise box to sell cassettes. I needed a sound system, as I was about to offer my show to any pub that would take me. My motto was, give me a PowerPoint and I'll give you a good show. So I purchased 2 Bose speakers and a mixing desk that I worked alongside me. Lighting was next. I rigged up 4 lights with white, amber, blue and red. White for bright songs, amber for ballads, red for the outback and blue for sad songs. I also worked these from my footbox. In 1976, Mary Kay and I had moved to Epping. The Epping Hotel in Sydney was near home and became my first venue with this rig. I started with about 10 friends who came along once a week on Wednesday night, and I saved the weekends for something better. It wasn't long before the crowd grew to standing room only, maybe 100 people. This success proved to me that I could do it. So I approached pubs and taverns all the way from Epping to Penrith in the west and to Wollongong in the south. They had rooms that previously had no entertainment booked in them. I took $10 on the door so the pubs had nothing to lose and everything to gain, especially on weeknights. Pennant Hills Inn and the Vicar of Wakefield at Dural, both suburbs in Sydney's northwest, soon proved to be perfect venues. In no time I added various pubs in Western Sydney, a tavern in Parramatta, one in Smithfield, Blacktown and even the Collingwood Hotel in Liverpool, just to name a few. Further afield, I added the North Wollongong Hotel. Now it seems amazing that I succeeded in some of these places. I bit the bullet and concentrated on Aussie songs only. I started with old folk songs, some Stan Costa songs, Chad Morgan, along with my own. As time went on, I wrote more and more of my own to replace the covers. I guess the originality of my stomping setup, which gave me the ease to work in any room, and the patriotism of my songs all came together and audiences related everywhere I went. In fact, this simple show worked them up so much at the end that after True Blue, I had to sing a calming down song to send them off a little quieter. The support I received from my audiences sure helped my confidence. This period really was the start of my improved songwriting and the beginning of real success. The Tamworth Golden Guitar Awards were gaining momentum and national recognition. I'd been going to the Tamworth Festival and performing my own show in various clubs with their resident bands since 1972. I'd entered various songs in the awards to no avail. With newfound confidence from my one-man pub show, it seemed like the right time to take this show to the Tamworth Country Music Festival and set up at what they call the Talk of the Town pub in Marius Street. I was feeling very cocky and tarted up a white ex-taxi FJ Holden Special with a handrail attached behind the front seat that was notorious for breaking kids' front teeth. It had my original flag designed on both sides of the car with the words "I'm fair dinkum." This was the title of a humorous song that came out of my suburbs show. I still have that FJ and it proudly bears many signatures of legends on the dashboard. Buddy Williams, Smokey Dawson, Slim Dusty, Lawsy, John Laws, and Chad Morgan. They're all there. I bought the Dinkum car number plate from the Roads and Traffic Authority and now it's on my Variety Bashute. I paraded the FJ at Tamworth, sitting on the bonnet with Karen Johns, who I recorded You've Gotta Be Fair Dinkum with. That year, the Peel River flooded and my FJ was stranded on the north side of town. I met a young bloke nicknamed BJ at the pub who offered to drive the FJ back to Sydney for me. When he arrived, I gave him a job as my roadie cum sound and lighting guy. He soon rigged up a lighting setup that he could operate with his feet as he fiddled with the sound mix. BJ stuck with me as my horizons expanded beyond the Sydney scene. By this time I was working at least 4 nights a week and building a street following. I'd progressed to a Commodore station wagon with a large esky full of merchandise strapped to the roof, but I needed a much better rig. Next step was an F100 Ford with a safari conversion. In other words, a huge station wagon with a V8 tuned to roar. Look out, Uluru, here we come. BJ and I took off to the outback, driving 14,000 kilometres through the heart of Australia. I was starting to wake up to the strength of being proud of who I was, an Aussie bushie.